the first wave of DMT use in the United States was all synthetic. In fact, DMT was discovered synthetically before it was ever found in nature. The same is true of 5-MeO-DMT.
How did they do that?
There was a Canadian chemist named Richard Helmuth Manske who I believe was looking at different alkaloids in strawberry plants, and he was synthesizing references for these potential strawberry alkaloids and made DMT. So he didn't know what he had made other than a potential natural product found in strawberries. And then it wasn't until Zara, much later, conducted self-experiments with injected DMT that people became fully aware of its psychoactivity, and then people started finding it in plants. I mean, the 1950s were and early 60s were, of course, a fascinating time in psychedelic research because you have these convergences of these amazing ideas. First, you have the discovery of serotonin, which is like, we take this for granted. Now it's in television commercials, but this was, of course, something that no one knew about. And suddenly they're finding this in all kinds of different animals. Initially, it was in the salivary glands of squid and in different animals. And then they're finding it in the human intestine. Then they're also finding that all of these plants that people worshipped in various indigenous societies also contain serotonin-like molecules. Then they discover LSD and find that that's maybe the most potent known pharmacological agent at that time. And it binds to serotonin receptors. It activates a serotonin-type response in isolated tissue. So there's like this weird triple convergence of information. Super potent, amazing compound LSD is discovered. Serotonin is discovered in all these different organisms, and there's a pharmacological convergence between the two of them. And then you have all these people worshiping serotonin-like molecules. So there was, a lot of enthusiasm at that time to figure all of this out.
So in terms of history, so we're talking about like somewhere in the 1950s, they started extracting DMT. The use of it orally dates back far longer than that because of use of MAO inhibitors and creating ayahuasca. But in terms of the first extraction, we can kind of isolate.
From plants to smoke?
Yeah.
It might have been even later. It might have been in the 80s.
Okay. So the idea that people thousands of years ago were able to do something along those lines is probably not accurate. Because they're talking about a burning bush. That's why it's appealing to people, right? The idea of Moses. Do you think that maybe the understanding of synthesis from, synthesizing this from these scholars, maybe they don't have enough of an understanding of chemistry?
Well, what would be really interesting is to do an experiment to see what were the materials that were available. How would this have been done? Would you have to use butter as your nonpolar solvent? How well would that work? What would your butter preparation be done? Would you take it rectally then? Is that how it would work? I mean, you have to kind of, what would your base have been?
Well, I think they were talking about it being something from, burning, right? A burning bush. Maybe it's just one of those things that sort of gets conflated, right? Because you have people today that are very aware that people smoke DMT and have these incredibly intense religious psychedelic experiences. And then maybe they looked at the acacia bush and said, oh, the acacia bush is rich in DMT. That's probably where the Moses story came from.
Right. Well, what's really interesting is, DMT has never been found in the human brain, even though Rick Strassman says that it has been. So a lot of people are constantly assigning altered states of consciousness to DMT. But we can have these states without DMT. I mean, maybe it's never been found in the human brain, but also there's ethical and experimental issues with sampling fluid from a living human's brain.
Right, but they have found it in living rats, right?
Yes,
this is fairly recently.
Yes,
this is the Cottonwood Research Foundation. That's their attempt is to try to prove that the pineal gland is a source for DMT. We know that DMT exists in the human body. We know that the liver produces it, and we know that the lungs produce it.
Yeah.
We're not totally aware of whether or not there's anecdotal evidence that points to the pineal gland.
Based on the rat idea and based on the presence of certain enzymes that could be responsible for it. But even if it is, then what? There's still a whole question of how is it released, how is it distributed, what receptors does it activate, and is it even necessary as an explanation for altered states of consciousness? Because there are other things in the brain other than DMT. DMT has never even been found in the brain, but there are other things. You have endogenous proteins that bind to the kappa opioid receptor, the same receptor that is responsible for the effect of salvia. Things like that. They could be responsible. I mean, even carbon dioxide itself can induce a pretty strong altered state of consciousness.
Right, which is why people like those psychedelic breathing exercises.
Yeah.
They're sort of, is it like hypoxic? Is that what it is? What are they doing when they have those, what is it called? There's a type of breathing exercise that induces psychedelic states.
Holotropic breath work.
Yeah. And that is the idea behind that, right? It increases the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood.
I haven't seen a mechanistic explanation.
Yeah, I think that was...
But it would make sense. In an early LSD psychotherapy, one of the things that they would do before giving someone LSD is they'd give them something called carbogen, which was a gas that contained carbon dioxide, and they would look at their response to the carbon dioxide inhalation, and if it induced a panic response, they would say, maybe you're not psychologically ready for this LSD experience. So that was, you're talking about a test. I mean, that was a very primitive early test that was used by psychiatrists to see if people had the psychological fortitude to withstand the experience.
That's fascinating. So tell me more about whatever is in the brain that mirrors the effects of salvia.
It's a protein. I can't remember off the top of my head what it's. If you look up endogenous ligand for kappa opioid receptor, it will come up. David Nichols recently wrote a paper that actually goes into alternate mechanisms of how the DMT type near-death experience could be produced by non-DMT compounds. But I mean, there was a lot of work also on endogenous NMDA receptor antagonists. There was a protein that was called alpha-endocytosin, or angel dustin, named after angel dust. But the main researcher died in a car accident, like right as he was making some kind of breakthrough, supposedly. But
cue spooky music.
yes. But this has been a long-standing question in psychiatry is, what causes psychosis? What causes altered states of consciousness? Is there an endogenous psychedelic? That was like one of the major motivations for a lot of this research in the 60s, finding the endogenous psychotogen that is responsible for schizophrenia. Now it doesn't seem to be the case, but it's still a question that comes up. What if dopamine is methylated in a certain way to create dimethylphenethylamine? Or what about this? What about that? I mean, Shulgin was very interested in it, about the metabolic production of various psychedelics that account for altered states of consciousness. It just hasn't been supported by evidence in a very strong way, even though people really find the idea compelling. And there was also the 5-MeO-DMT in schizophrenic people's urine. That's also a thing.